April 30th, 1945. Deep in the heart of Berlin, as Soviet shells rained down on the Reich Chancellery and Adolf Hitler put a bullet in his brain, one massive German tank was still fighting. King Tiger 314, a 68-ton steel monster with nearly 200 millimeters of frontal armor, had just destroyed its 39th Soviet tank in the battle for Berlin. By the end of the next day, this beast would be disabled not by Soviet fire, but by a German mine placed by their own troops weeks earlier. This is the story of the last King Tiger in Berlin and its impossible final battle. Late April 1945, the Third Reich was dying and everyone knew it. The Soviet Red Army had smashed through German defenses on the Silo Heights and was now closing in on Berlin like a vice. But among the retreating German forces was something special. Around 12 King Tiger tanks from SS Heavy Panzer Battalion 503. These weren't your average tanks. The King Tiger, or Tiger II, was one of the most powerful armored vehicles ever built during World War II. With its 88mm main gun that could punch through nearly any Allied tank at extreme range, and armor thick enough to shrug off most enemy fire, it was an absolute beast on the battlefield. But it came with massive problems. The thing weighed 68 tons, so heavy it couldn't cross most bridges without collapsing them. It broke down constantly, guzzled fuel like crazy, and was so massive it could barely maneuver through city streets. By late April 1945, Germany was running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, train crews, and most importantly, time. SS Heavy Panzer Battalion 503 had been formed back in July 1943 and spent most of the war on the Eastern Front, racking up impressive kill counts against Soviet armor. In early September 1944, they began receiving the new Tiger, 2 tanks around Paderborn, Germany, converting from their older Tiger I models. By the end of January 1945, they'd received a steady stream of 31 King Tigers and were busy training new crews for the hell that was coming. The battalion was supposed to have 45 tanks total, but by April 15th they reported only 39 tanks, with just 12 being King Tigers and only 10 of those actually operational. But just 8 days before deployment, they got a new commander, SS Sturmbannführer Fritz Herzig, basically a major. Despite the terrible timing, Herzig proved to be a skilled and aggressive leader who would squeeze every last drop of combat effectiveness out of his dwindling battalion. Interestingly, this unit had also participated in Operation Solstice back in mid-February 1945, a desperate German counteroffensive that temporarily stopped the Soviet advance on Berlin and bought the Reich a few more precious weeks of existence. But by April, those weeks had run out. The massive Berlin offensive kicked off on April 16, 1945, and these dozen tanks were thrown into the meat grinder at the Silo Heights, the last major defensive position before Berlin itself. The fighting was apocalyptic. Soviet artillery pulverized German positions with thousands of guns firing simultaneously. The sky turned orange with the glow of explosions, and the earth itself seemed to shake under the bombardment. The King Tigers fought back ferociously, their 88mm guns taking a devastating toll on advancing Soviet tanks. But numbers and firepower eventually won out. Between 6 and 9 King Tigers survived the slaughter and retreated into Berlin itself on April 24th, falling back with the remnants of the German army into the capital's ruins. Berlin had once been a symbol of German pride, its grand boulevards and monuments representing Nazi power. Now those same streets echoed with the grinding of armored tracks and the thunderous roar of tank engines. Civilians who hadn't fled huddled in cellars while steel beasts rolled past their windows. These surviving tanks were attached to Kampfgruppe Munker under SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Munker, which was charged with defending the government district, nicknamed the Citadel or Citadel. This was the heart of Nazi power, encompassing the Reichstag, Brandenburg Gate, and the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler cowered in his bunker below ground. The tanks were distributed in pairs around the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland sector. One group of King Tigers was positioned at the Potsdamer Bahnhof railway station in the southeast corner of the government sector. This wasn't a random choice. German planners specifically selected train stations as defensive positions because they had large plazas in front of them, giving the tanks excellent visibility and clear fields of fire across open ground. From this position, they could engage Soviet armor trying to cross the Landwehr Canal and advance on Hitler's bunker. The defensive mission was considered crucial. The survival of Berlin's defenses largely depended on whether these few remaining heavy tanks could hold their positions. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda continued spreading rumors that relief armies were heading to save the city. though everyone with any sense knew that was complete bullshit. Two tanks became particularly famous in the final battle: King Tiger 314, commanded by SS Unterscharführer Georg Diers, and King Tiger 100, commanded by SS Hauptscharführer Karl Körner. Both men were experienced tankers who'd survived years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. Körner in particular had a fearsome reputation. German sources claimed he'd destroyed over 100 Soviet tanks in just the last 3 months of fighting, a number that's almost certainly exaggerated by Nazi propaganda, desperate for good news. But even accounting for inflation and wartime propaganda, the guy was clearly lethal behind a gun sight. On April 28th, Hitler personally decorated Battalion Commander Obersturmbannführer Herzig with the Knight's Cross inside his bunker, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. It was a surreal ceremony in an underground shelter while the city above burned and Soviet forces closed in from all sides. That same day, with Soviet forces pressing closer to the government district, King Tigers 314 and 100 received orders to counterattack. They were to advance from Potsdamer Station toward the Anhalter Station several blocks to the southeast, engaging Soviet armor all the way. This wasn't some grand offensive to save Berlin. That ship had sailed weeks ago. This was about buying time, making the Soviets pay in blood for every meter of ground, and maintaining some semblance of defensive cohesion, while Hitler's inner circle decided what the hell to do next. The two massive tanks rumbled forward through rubble-choked streets, their engines roaring and tracks grinding over broken masonry. The thunderous noise of their advance actually raised the morale of German soldiers and SS units who were still committed to the fight, seeing these steel monsters as proof they could still resist. Soviet forces immediately engaged them with everything they had: T-34/85 medium tanks with 85mm guns, JS-2 heavy tanks mounting massive 122mm cannons, anti-tank guns positioned in buildings, and infantry with Panzerfausts hiding in the ruins, waiting to ambush at close range. The battle raged all day on April 28th and into the 29th across multiple city blocks. The King Tiger's thick armor deflected most hits, while their 88mm guns methodically destroyed Soviet tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. But weight of numbers was overwhelming, and eventually both tanks were forced to retreat back to Potsdamer Platz as night fell. On the morning of April 30th, the day Hitler would kill himself, Soviet armor made another aggressive push deeper into the government district. They were trying to cross Moltke Bridge to assault the Reichstag, but Diers' King Tiger 314 stopped them cold, destroying around 30 Soviet tanks in a single engagement near the Reichstag building. During this same fighting, Körner's King Tiger 100 took a direct hit that smashed into the right front corner, blowing off the track and causing serious damage to the drive sprocket and final drive. The massive tank was immobilized, but the crew kept fighting from their disabled vehicle, using it as a static gun platform. Then something even worse happened. Later that day, a full platoon of Soviet infantry emerged from a sewer manhole right next to the tank. Apparently, the Soviets had been using Berlin's extensive underground network to infiltrate German positions. The Germans fought them off in brutal close-quarters combat, but by evening, King Tiger 100 was completely out of ammunition and going nowhere. Körner and his crew had no choice but to abandon their steel fortress and try to escape on foot through the Soviet-infested streets. Diers' King Tiger 314 was now the last operational King Tiger in the entire Citadel sector. By his crew's count, they destroyed 39 Soviet tanks in the battle for Berlin, but 314 was running on fumes with dwindling ammunition, and the situation was completely hopeless. That afternoon at around 3:30 p.m., Hitler shot himself in his bunker. Eva Braun, who'd married him just hours earlier, took cyanide at the same time. When word spread through the remaining defenders over the next several hours, a decision was made. They would attempt to break out from the Reich Chancellery area, trying to escape north across the Weidendammer Bridge towards Spandau. At 9 p.m. on the evening of May 1st, the breakout began. Every functioning vehicle was assembled: King Tiger 314, various half-tracks and armored cars from the Nordland Division, trucks, anything that could move, along with hundreds of German troops and desperate civilians trying to escape the doomed city. Among the group was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in the Nazi regime. Bormann's fate would remain a mystery for decades. His remains wouldn't be discovered until 1972, and he was tried in absentia at the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to death should he ever be found alive. The breakout was led by SS Brigade Führer Gustav Krukenberg, and the groups divided themselves to increase their chances of success. Around 30 vehicles from the Nordland Division participated, carrying not just soldiers but also German officials and civilians who knew Soviet capture meant almost certain death or decades in the Gulag. King Tiger 314 was at the tip of the spear. As the column moved through Friedrichstrasse toward the Weidendammer Bridge around midnight, Soviet forces opened up with everything they had. Artillery shells began falling on the convoy, destroying several vehicles and forcing others to stop. But the King Tiger kept pushing forward, its 88mm cannon firing at Soviet positions while machine guns raked the streets. The massive tank managed to reach a nearby U-Bahn station entrance and actually subverted an anti-tank blockade the Soviets had set up, using its bulk and firepower to punch through. Behind the King Tiger, hundreds of soldiers and civilians followed in the tank's wake, using its bulk as a shield. Many were cut down by Soviet machine gun and artillery fire in the horrific crossfire that turned Friedrichstrasse into a killing zone. The King Tiger led the charge across the Weidendammer Bridge as tracers lit up the night sky and explosions erupted all around. It was absolute chaos. The bridge was narrow, Soviet fire was coming from multiple directions, and the people packed behind the tank were getting massacred. But somehow, incredibly, 314 made it across. The tank continued pushing northwest through Berlin on Chaucerstrasse, but hit another large Soviet blockade. Diaz had to back the massive tank away and find an alternate route through the rubble-choked streets. Every minute they spent exposed increased the chances of a lucky Soviet hit or running into a position they couldn't break through. They reached Humboldt Park about 2 kilometers north of the bridge, passing one of Berlin's giant flak towers, those massive concrete anti-aircraft fortresses that still dotted the city. The Humboldt Park Tower was still operational, its anti-aircraft guns pointing uselessly at a sky the Luftwaffe no longer controlled. The crew probably thought they were going to make it. They'd survived the impossible, leading hundreds of people through a Soviet kill zone and coming out the other side. They were in northwestern Berlin now, and Spandau was within reach. But then came the cruel twist of fate. As King Tiger 314 rolled toward the U-Bahn station at Schönhauser Alley in the early morning hours of May 2nd, trying to navigate through a bridge above the S-Bahn station, there was a tremendous explosion. The tank lurched violently as its right track was blown clean off. Metal fragments and debris showered the area as the massive vehicle ground to a halt, listing to one side. They'd hit a mine, a German mine, one of thousands that had been laid weeks earlier when the Wehrmacht was preparing Berlin's defenses, never imagining their own tanks would be trying to escape through those same streets. The Germans had mined their own city, and now those defenses were killing them. The crew worked frantically to repair the track. They knew if they could get it back on, they might still have a chance. But the damage was too severe. The mine had completely destroyed the track assembly, and Soviet forces were closing in on the noise of the explosion. After several desperate minutes, Diaz gave the order. Abandon the tank. Destroy it if possible, but get out now. The 5-man crew piled out of their disabled beast. Diaz, his gunner, his driver, his radio operator, and his loader Alex Summer. They'd survived everything the Soviets could throw at them, only to be stopped by their own mine. In the chaos of the escape, loader Alex Summer was shot in the stomach, probably by Soviet infantry that had surrounded the area. He collapsed and was declared missing. His fate remains unknown to this day. He's one of millions who simply vanished in the apocalypse of Berlin's fall. Diaz and the other 3 surviving crew members tried to continue their escape on foot, but were eventually captured by Soviet forces. They would spend the next 4 years in Soviet POW camps before being released in 1949. Lucky to be alive when so many others died in captivity. Diaz himself survived captivity and lived through the Cold War, carrying the memories of those final apocalyptic days when he'd commanded one of the last operational King Tigers in existence. Karl Kerner, the commander of Tiger 100, who'd abandoned his tank the day before, also survived the war and lived until 1997, dying at age 77 with his incredible combat record intact. The wreck of King Tiger 314 sat in the streets of northern Berlin for weeks before Soviet recovery teams scrapped it, melting down the metal and repurposing it. Nothing remains of the tank today except photographs and the memories of those who saw it fight. Today, only a handful of King Tigers exist in museums around the world, silent monuments to one of history's most powerful but ultimately doomed weapons. The only example that still runs is at the Tank Museum in Saumur, France. Others can be found in the UK, Germany, and Belgium. Massive, imposing vehicles that shock visitors with their sheer size. The story of these last King Tigers in Berlin exemplifies everything about the final days of Nazi Germany. Technologically impressive but strategically bankrupt, fighting with skill and determination for a cause that was already lost and ultimately destroyed not just by their enemies, but by their own hubris. These tanks were designed for open field warfare on the Eastern Front, where their long-range guns and heavy armor could dominate. Instead, they found themselves trapped in an urban hellscape, burning through irreplaceable fuel to crawl through rubble-choked streets, unable to maneuver or exploit their advantages. Yet even in defeat, they fought with ferocity. 39 Soviet tanks destroyed by one King Tiger crew in a battle they knew they couldn't win. Not because they believed in ultimate victory. By late April 1945, even the most fanatical Nazi knew the war was over, but because they were soldiers doing their job in impossible circumstances. The irony is that these magnificent machines, built to be unstoppable weapons of conquest, ended their war as desperate escape vehicles for refugees and defeated soldiers. And even then, they were stopped not by Soviet firepower, but by German mines laid weeks earlier in a defensive plan that had completely fallen apart. That's the story of the last King Tiger in Berlin, a steel monster that fought to the bitter end, destroying dozens of enemy tanks and leading hundreds through hell, only to be brought down by the very defenses it was supposed to protect. A fitting end to a weapon that represented everything wrong with Nazi Germany's war. Impressive on paper, deadly in action, but ultimately defeated by its own impossible situation.